my pleasure to introduce the winners.
Hello, my name is Jimmy Carter. There is my lovely wife, Rosalynn. I tell you, marrying her was the pinnacle of my life. In fact, I do remember the very first time I saw her. She was just lying in her bed, covered in a blanket and half naked.
James R. Carter, you had better explain that statement.
Well, she was 3 days old. You see, at that time, the Smiths, Rosalynn's family, and the Carters, we were actually next door neighbors in Plains. And my mother, Miss Lillian, was a nurse, and she actually delivered Eleanor Rosalind Smith on August 18th, 1927. I had been born 3 years earlier, October the 1st, 1924, in the Y Sanitarium. I become the first person to become a president who has actually been born in a hospital. About a year later, my father, Earl, moved the family to Archer, Georgia, about 2.5 miles away from Plains. It was there my sister Ruth was born, joining Gloria and myself. And my father began expanding his business and his community organizations that he did. He ended up having over 5,000 acres of land. Now, while Daddy was expanding his business and involvement in the community, my mother, she had some rather interesting hobbies. She smoked and played poker. But she also worked sometimes 20 hours a day at nursing hospitals and sanitariums, especially among the poor of the community, among the folks of color. As a matter of fact, growing up, my friends were the little boys about colored workers who I, even as a youngster, would work right beside them out there in the field, pulling up those peanuts. Like my daddy, I did learn to become a jack of all trades, especially with woodworking. Now, my education took place in an all-white school, of course, and 3 years behind me, in that same school, was a friend of my sister Ruth's, Rosalind Smith.
Whereas Jimmy grew up in the country on a farm, our family lived right in the middle of Plains. I was the oldest of 4 children, had 2 brothers and a sister. My father, Edgar, drove our school bus. He owned an auto mechanic shop and had a small farm outside town. Religion was very important in our family, and I came to believe in a God who punished you for wrongdoings, just as my father would punish me for my little indiscretions with spankings. Although I wasn't very competitive, I liked to be alone. I played with paper dolls, read books, Heidi being my favorite. When I was 13, tragedy struck. That summer, my father was diagnosed with incurable leukemia. Over the next 18 months, Mother would care for the younger children, and I would take care of Father, watching Miss Lily and give him his injections. One night he gathered us all by his bedside and told us it was clear he was not going to recover, and that his last wish was that we all get a college education, which he had not. I ran out of the house crying. I felt my childhood had ended that night. In the middle of the night, my daddy was dead at the age of 44. Well, for the longest time afterwards, I was troubled with the thought that maybe I was the reason for my father's death. I prayed for his recovery, and my prayers were not answered. Was it because God didn't love me? Because I'd been bad? Well, after my father's death, I had to help take care of my brothers and sister. I helped Mama with her dressmaking business. I worked in a beauty parlor while still attending school. Through all those years, I remained friends with Jimmy's sister. We double dated, did other outings together, but her brother never paid me no mind, nor did I him. I graduated valedictorian and was accepted at Georgia Southwestern College, a 2-year community school. The year was 1944. I'd made my father's wish come true. I was going to college, but our country was in the midst of a world war.
I was a freshman at Georgia Southwestern when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941. I joined our Naval Reserve Officer training, and as I finished my sophomore year, I actually got an appointment to the Naval Academy in 1943. We were all on an accelerated course to finish in 3 years instead of 4. Then 1945 came. It was a year full of shocking events. Well, first, President Roosevelt died in April. Then President Truman dropped those 2 atomic bombs on Japan, hastening the end of the war. And then in Plains, Georgia, well, an event occurred that began over 75 years of togetherness.
While Jimmy was away in Annapolis, I continued spending many hours at the Carter home with my friend Ruth. She kept trying to arrange for me to be there when Jimmy would come home, knowing I'd already fallen for her brother, pictured in his midshipman uniform. But Jimmy was 3 years older than me, so popular. He was dating the current Miss Georgia Southwestern, Annelle Green. Well, one day in August, Jimmy and I had spent some time together helping clean up a picnic area. My shyness just fell away. I found out I could talk to him. Well, that night I attended a church youth meeting while Ruth and Jimmy were going to double date to see a movie with Annelle. She was called away on a family matter. They were driving through town and spotted me standing outside the church. They asked me to join them.
I kissed her the very first date. And the next morning I told my mother I was going to marry Rosalynn Smith. Now, of course I had to go back to school, so our communication was basically through letters. But on Christmas I gave her this little silver compact engraved with these letters, ILYTG. That was just an old little card saying, meaning, I love you the goodest. And in February, I proposed.
But I had to say no. I had to keep a promise to my father to graduate. But soon after graduation from junior college and Jimmy's graduation at the Naval Academy, we were married at the Plains Methodist Church on July 7, 1946. Well, as a Navy wife, I already knew what was in store for me. As one of the first gifts that Jimmy sent me after I said yes was the 200-page book, The Navy Wife. It was a manual detailing the manners and what to expect being married to a Navy man. It also warned me you'd be moving from post to post. First we were in Norfolk, Virginia, where our son Jack was born. Then we went on to New London, Connecticut. Then Hawaii, where Chip was born. Then San Diego, California, and then back to New London, where Darnell, we call him Jeff, was born. Then on to Schenectady, New York. Meanwhile, Jimmy was moving from ensign to lieutenant junior grade.
And having a brush with death. My first 2 assignments were on ships. They were being used as testing centers for all sorts of new equipment, so I was becoming very familiar with all the new electronics. Then I began my service on submarines, where an incident really did bring me close to seeing the Lord. I was on night watch on the bridge of the USS Pomfret. We were making a surface run during a storm, which was, I think, the worst I'd ever seen in my life. Now, my position was above deck, standing upon this chest-high metal protector. About 2 a.m., I saw this enormous wave coming for us, so I kneeled down behind that protector and I locked my arms around it. But that wave broke directly on top of me, ripping me from my position and throwing me overboard out into the ocean. Well, I just kept churning my arms the best I could to stay afloat. And when the wave receded, I found myself actually back on top of that sub holding onto one of its guns. Now, what are the odds of that? And during the lull, I crawled back behind that protector, and this time I actually tethered myself in with ropes. Now, I was in one piece, but actually our sub was damaged, including our communication equipment. And so we could not send messages, and a report actually went out to all ships that we were presumed lost and to look for survivors, if there were any. Well, as Rosie mentioned, our last move was to Schenectady, New York, and that's when I began my most important job in the Navy. Admiral Rickover handpicked me to develop a small nuclear reactor to be used on our nation's first nuclear submarine, USS Seawolf. I must tell you, this was quite a career accomplishment.
Well, which led to a few days of apprehension and worry for me. On December 12, 1952, the reactor core of the Chalk River, Canada nuclear plant melted down, creating 1 million liters of radioactive water and contaminated mechanical parts, which then had to be removed. Jimmy was assigned to be the head of one of the teams to accomplish this dangerous task.
A mock-up reactor had been built. We practiced donning our full protective gear, rushing in to disassemble and bring out what parts we could in 90 seconds. That was the maximum allowable time to be exposed to radiation. Only after perfecting this routine did we enter the real reactor to retrieve the contaminated parts. And my crew made it back out in 89 seconds. Fortunately, the effects on us were really quite minimal, although I did test positive for radiation in my yarn for about 6 months. And by the way, the plant was totally reopened. Then in early April of '53, I received word from home that my father was ill. And then in July, I obtained leave to go home. Because you see, my daddy was dying of pancreatic cancer. Over the next few weeks, I was just shocked to learn all the things he had done for his community, and amazed at the continual flow of people coming to pay their last respects and to bring gifts to simply try to say thank you for all the help and all the support that he had given them over the years. And I came to realize that so much of our tiny community depended on my father. And on July 22nd, 1953, that influence ended as my father died. And on the long ride home back up to Schenectady, I thought, and I made a major decision.
Oh, Jimmy, I'm so sorry for your loss. How are things at home? How's Miss Lillian?
Everything's all right, Rosie, but I want you to sit down because I have something I got to tell you. Rosie, I'm going to apply for approval to leave the Navy and return home and to continue my daddy's legacy.
You're going to do what?
No, not just me. Us, the family, we're going home.
No, not me, not my children, Jim. Jimmy, why would you want to throw away your Navy career? You're one of only 2 men working on that nuclear reactor on the Seawolf. Jack's in kindergarten. There are no kindergartens in Plains. Look, we live in the North now, where there isn't any of this hatred exposed to the hatred of blacks and the segregation of the South. No, Jimmy, I'm going to stay here. Oh, Jimmy, I've lived in so many wonderful places I never thought I'd ever live, like Hawaii. Oh, Jimmy, I used to dream of going to distant, exciting places. Plains still only has 650 people in it. Oh, Jimmy, I have independence here. If we live in the South, in the Plains, my mother and your mother will be criticizing everything I do. You know they will. Oh, Jimmy, no, we have a comfortable house here. Where are we going to live back then? No, Jimmy, I'm staying here.
Rosie, shh. Sit back down. Now look, this is something I've got to do for our family, for our community. I mean, that community depends upon the Carter Holdings and everything we put into it. Now, my mother's too distraught to run a business. My sisters, they had their own family problems. And Billy, he's only 14 years old. I know he's being groomed to take over, but he can't do it now. I'm sorry, Rosie, but my mind is made up. This is something that we must do. Rosie barely spoke a single word to me on that long ride back home to Plains. And the only housing we could find was a government-subsidized community at $30 a month. Look, Rosie, all will be well. You will be glad to be back in Plains, and maybe we could try for that little girl that we've been trying to have.
The IRS audited Mr. Carter's last few returns. And we had to use the cash to settle his estate. The drought then devastated our crops and other farmers' crops, so they could not pay the bills that they owed us. Our income that first year was $280. Jimmy, I will never be glad.
That drought was devastating. But there was a silver lining because I had one crop that survived. It was called Virginia Bunch 67. So the following year, I bought all the Virginia Bunch 67 seed I could from what are called experiment station breeders. So in the future, I would be producing peanuts that would be certified as pure seed to sell directly to other farmers. And this became a major source of income for us. Then I designed our own shelling plant. I bought more land, I built warehouses, I served on the Sumter County Board of Education, and I saw the deplorable conditions of our black schools. And when I refused to join the White Citizens Council, I found a sign on my office door that read, "Coombs and Carter go together."
Well, my life in Plains was just as I had anticipated, because I made it so. I stayed home. I would not participate in clubs. My mother said the neighbors thought me aloof and I should try to mingle more. Well, I slowly took her advice and became more neighborly. By the way, my mother became a big help to me, especially watching the children when needed. And the children had an entire extended family, which they never could have enjoyed being in Navy kids. I joined Jimmy's Baptist Church because I wanted us to be a one church family, but I remained a Methodist at heart. Eventually, we both taught Sunday school, which we would do for the rest of our lives. And we began enjoying pastimes together, camping with the children, taking trips, taking classes together. My "I will never be glad" statement was evolving into one I said with a smile. "Jimmy, I will never be glad." Then one day, Jimmy asked me to come to the office and cover for him while he had some business elsewhere. And quickly that evolved to my being the office manager and accounting and ours becoming a working partnership. And that could never have happened in the Navy. And on Jimmy's 38th birthday in 1962, he filed to run for state senator. And I threw myself into helping him. Now, not only were we business partners, but we were political partners. We had no idea that what we were getting into, especially with this race for the state senate. But first there was the Democrat primary against Homer Moore. Whoever won would run unopposed in the general election, as there was no Republican candidate. Well, we soon learned politics can be dirty.
Our Senate district included 7 different counties, one of them being Quitman County, which was run by a crooked politician named Joe Hurst. In fact, that man was so crooked that when Moore said to Hurst, "Look, I'm not going to need any of your special help in this election," well, he replied, "Look, I'm going to stuff that ballot box anyway. We do it every year, and I don't want my people to get out of practice." Well, I lost that primary overall by 139 votes, and the difference was Quitman County. There I lost by 224 votes out of 496 cast. But on recount, they discovered that only 333 voters had shown up that day. Still, the state Democratic Convention declared Moore the winner, and the Quitman County Democratic Committee, they also sided with Moore.
We then got the case before a circuit court, Judge Crow, and when they opened the cardboard ballot box in the courtroom, there were no voter lists and no ballot stubs. And there were over 100 votes in a folded pile with a rubber band around them. Well, the judge declared all Quitman County ballots invalid, and Jimmy seemingly won the primary by 65 votes.
But it wasn't over. The day before the general election, a Superior Court judge ordered all names scratched from that ballot and said it would be a total write-in vote. And I won by 831 votes, and I was on my very first step towards the presidency.
Well, Jimmy served 2 terms as state senator, and then in 1968 ran for governor. He lost and was devastated.
Devastated and very depressed. And if it hadn't been for my younger sister, Ruth Carter Stapleton, I shudder to think what I would have done. You see, Ruth had a true born-again experience and had begun preaching across the South. So we walked in a very quiet place in the woods. And she explained to me her method of what she called inner healing, and suggested that I should focus more on my religious life and spiritual life, and to simply accept God's will for me. I admitted to her I probably could give up anything but one thing: politics. However, taking her advice, I did work as a Baptist pioneer missionary, talking face to face with people about their faith. And I do believe I had my own born-again experience by doing that.
Then in 1966, Miss Lillian shocked us by joining the Peace Corps at the age of 68. And in 1967, after years and years of trying, at the age of 40, I became pregnant again. Amy Lynn was born in October. By 1970, our business had grown, so we now had assets of over $800,000, more than a life in the Navy would have ever brought us. Jimmy,
Yeah.
I think I can be happy again.
But I lost that election. I tried to be a good loser, but I'm sorry, a good loser is still a loser, and I would not lose again. In 1970, I ran for governor, what I would call myself being a conservative progressive. My entire family helped along with the campaign, including family and friends who became known as the Peanut Brigade, and they traveled all across Georgia. January 12, 1971, I was inaugurated as the governor of Georgia, and I declared that the time for racial discrimination is over. No poor, rural, weak, or black person should ever be deprived the opportunity of an education, of a job, or simple justice.
But as First Lady of Georgia, my main focus was to improve services for the mentally and emotionally challenged. Jimmy created a commission, and the number of mental health facilities grew from 23 to 134. Although I was not officially in charge, I had a lot to learn. I became the face of our endeavors, even working in various facilities.
Now, two highlights of my administration were: number one, zero budget. And what that meant was this: just because something got money in the last budget didn't necessarily mean it was going to get money this time. It had to prove its worth. Then we also consolidated the number of state departments from over 300 down to only 22. And when I left that office, we had a $200 million surplus. Something else interesting: I created a biracial civil disorder unit, which would enter a community where tensions were high before confrontation broke out. It reduced the number of hours our state police spent on civil disorder from over 49,000 man-hours to only 177. Now, the office of Governor of Georgia is one of the strongest in the nation, including having that line item veto. But it also came with just a one-term, 4-year limit. So as early as 1972, I began planning my run for president.
Jimmy had to start planning early because few people outside of Georgia even knew who he was. In late 1975, in a Gallup poll of Democrats, only 2.5% voted Jimmy as their first choice among the candidates. He was running amongst the biggest names in the party: Ed Muskie, Sergeant Shriver, Birch Bayh, and looming over all of them was Ted Kennedy.
It was an uphill battle. In my first big event in Des Moines, Iowa, we prepared for 200 people, and we had 3 show up. So we just took our flyers, we began walking the streets, passing it out, a routine we would continue throughout that campaign. And at rallies, I always started with, "Hello, my name is Jimmy Carter, and I am running for president." And then later I would add, "And I will never lie to you." Well, that was sort of in contrast to Richard Nixon's biggest perceived flaw, and that was lying, especially during the Watergate scandal.
Again, the whole family and the Peanut Brigade fanned out across the nation to campaign. In 1975, Jimmy wrote a book, Why Not the Best? It was the first of over 40 books that he would write. But it looked as if it was not going to be enough. Our campaign was broke and in debt.
But because of my friendship with Phil Walden, head of Capricorn Records, he arranged fundraising concerts by the Allman Brothers and by Charlie Daniels. They raised over $100,000. And this continued throughout that campaign, especially the Allman Brothers. In fact, later I said, you know what? If it weren't for the Allman Brothers, I might not have been president.
Well, and an ill-conceived interview with Playboy magazine almost prevented you from being president. Our campaign folks thought it would allow us to reach a large audience. After all, Martin Luther King Jr. and Democrat Governor Jerry Brown had given interviews to the magazine. Well, besides its articles, the magazine featured lovely women in very little clothing. The token response of some men caught reading the magazines always, oh, I'll just read it for the articles. Well, out of an 8,000-word interview, only a few sentences made headlines.
Now, yes, in answer to one of the last questions they asked me, I said, I have looked with a lot of women with lust. I have committed adultery in my heart. I was just trying to explain that Christ set some very high standards when he said, quote, anyone who looks on a woman with lust has committed adultery in his heart. But I was trying to explain that God forgives. And I certainly would not be one who would judge people. That article appeared September 22nd, just 6 weeks before the general election. And I lost the support of preachers Billy Graham and Oral Roberts. But fortunately for me, there was one more debate left with President Ford, and in it he made his own big gaffe. He actually responded to a question and said this, so there is no Soviet domination in Eastern Europe, and he said there never will be under a Ford administration. Really? The Iron Curtain was there, the Berlin Wall, Soviet occupation of all those countries. I'm sorry, it made Ford's answer look very ill-conceived.
Well, both candidates took advantage of the new federal election campaign fund, which gave each candidate approximately $20 million to spend, but no other fundraising was allowed. Jimmy won 50 to 48% of the popular vote and 297 to 240 in the electoral college vote. Actually, 20 states were decided by just 5 points or less. He started his inaugural address in a very gracious manner.
For my predecessor and for our nation, I want to thank him for all he has done to heal this nation. I then laid out a philosophy that I hoped when my term ended, we could look back and say, we renewed our search for humility, for mercy, and for justice. That we had torn down the barriers that separate those of different races, region, and religion. That we had found productive work for all those who wanted to perform it. And that we had strengthened the American family, the basis of our society. That we had ensured respect for the law and equal treatment under the law. And we had enabled our people to once again be proud of their government. And I also wanted people to feel we were simply just one of them. So during that inauguration parade, we all got out of our car and we simply walked along waving and shaking hands with people. Now, the very next day, my very first official act in office was to pardon those men and women who had fled to Canada, especially during the Vietnam War. And just 2 weeks into my presidency, I was dressed in this cardigan sweater. Thank you, Rosie. One of our most urgent projects is to develop a national energy policy. The United States is the only major industrial country without a comprehensive long-range energy policy. And our program is going to emphasize conservation. All of us must learn how to waste less energy. Now, for example, simply by keeping our thermostats in the winter at 65 degrees during the day and 55 degrees at night, we could save half the current shortage of natural gas.
Well, Jim had put this into effect at the White House, so I got out my long underwear and suffered through one of the coldest winters in D.C. He also would eventually install solar panels up on the roof. Well, my first chore was to settle in at the mansion with two of our three sons, Jeff and Chip, and of course our 9-year-old daughter, Amy. I wanted to place my focus on three things: to continue my work on mental health, to help get the Equal Rights Amendment passed, and to help the aged. I set up the first official office with the First Lady in the East Wing and hired the first Chief of Staff. And just over 2 months after taking office, the President's Commission on Mental Health officially began. I was made honorary chairperson. I would be a very active honorary chairperson. The Commission's culmination was the passage of the Mental Health Systems Act in September of 1980. I then set out on a groundbreaking trip for First Lady.
Because you see, besides her own agenda, I had another job for Rosie, most special advisor to the President. And in that role in June, I sent her on a 7-nation tour of Latin America to meet with leaders of those countries and to explain a few things. I'd recently signed the American Convention on Human Rights. That was passed back in 1969, but we had never signed on to it. There also had been passed in '67 a nuclear freeze of our whole Latin America and Central America area, but again, we had never signed on to it. I did. I wanted to let Rosie explain the detail of my decisions to those leaders.
Well, upon my return, I delivered a policy report. The Senate sent a unanimous note of congratulations, and I had a 74% approval as ambassador. I needed to do this to leave Jim free to lay the groundwork on many accomplishments he wanted to achieve.
Well, first, we passed emergency legislation to solve our natural gas crisis. Then we passed a reorganization of government bill, abolished several agencies. I cut my own White House staff by some 28%. But we also established one new department, the Department of Energy, to help with our energy difficulties. And then in September, I took a very controversial action. I signed the Panama Canal Treaty. Past presidents before me, especially from Johnson to Ford, all wrestled with the problem of Panama. It had become a powder keg because in past decades, Panamanians felt they should now control the canal. The right of moral action was to allow them to do so. But the polls said our country was totally against the idea, and it would be an uphill battle for me to get the 67 votes I needed in the Senate to ratify it. What we did, we created 2 treaties. One laid out a procedure that would turn over control in the year 2000, and the other detailed our right to intervene if ever the canal was threatened. On September the 7th, 1977, the treaties were signed, and the hard work began for Senate ratification. Hard work indeed, because only 1/3 of our people were actually for it.
Jimmy, why are you doing these controversial things now? Wait for your second term.
Rosie, if securing a second term was more important to me than doing what was right, then I'd wait. But it's not, and I'm not going to do anything that's going to harm my country.
Well, the thing you can do to harm your country the most is to not get reelected. So Jimmy went to work, lobbying for the votes needed and gained support of ex-presidents Nixon and Ford. And in March of 1978, the treaty was ratified, 68-32. And when the canal finally turned over on December 31st, 1999, Jimmy represented the United States at the ceremony. And besides being special advisor and even attending cabinet meetings, I was also White House hostess. So I decided that only wine would be served at official functions, for which I was ridiculed, like past first ladies who had limited alcohol before me. Sarah Polk, she was called. Lemonade, Lucy Hayes. Well, I became known as Rosalynn.
Now, during my first year in office, I had separate one-on-one visits with both Anwar Sadat of Egypt and Menachem Begin of Israel. Then the Egyptian president visit is a daring move because there was no Arab nation who even recognized Israel's existence. All this set the stage for the September 1978 summit between the two men and their advisors up at Camp David to hopefully lay the groundwork to find some sort of treaty between these two great nations who had already experienced 3 wars in the past 10 years.
Well, seeing the ancient animosity that these countries and nations held, and knowing the high probability of failure, I said to Jimmy, are you ready to be a scapegoat? I mean, what if they come and it's just a gigantic failure?
Rose, as I've told you before, you can guarantee you're going to fail if you never try. And if you don't try, you can guarantee you're never going to succeed. Well, we all anticipated a 3 to 4 day meeting.
It lasted 13 days. I kept detailed notes of all the happenings, although there were several occasions when I had to return to Washington to take Jim's place for events.
Now, these two men had already begun courageous negotiations back in December of '77. Especially courageous for Sadat. He had been denounced as a traitor by all the Arab nations for his visit to Israel and even for these discussions. But little progress had been made, and both leaders accepted my invitation to come to Camp David. We all agreed secrecy was of the utmost, and if the two leaders failed to come find some sort of common ground, then I would present my own proposal and let each man explain his objections to it.
Well, September 5th, 1978, the meeting began on an encouraging note, as both men, arriving separately, hugged and kissed Jimmy on the cheek. But by the end of day 1, it seemed as if Mr. Begin came seeking just small concessions, not a major agreement. Day 2 was even worse, as Mr. Sadat presented his own peace plan with so many positions that were totally unacceptable to the Israelis that failure just seemed certain.
Day 3 resulted in more angry exchanges between these two men, and the next day, they were both ready to leave. But I reminded both men, they had promised me that they would at least consider our American plan, and so they stayed. Now, Begin objected to almost everything in our plan when he saw it, even wording that the Israelis had accepted in the past. I then met with Sadat, and I even suggested that, look, at least we could come to an agreement that the world would understand. I already feared for that man's safety. Well, there were people in his delegation who were strongly opposed to him being there. As a matter of fact, I had such a bad feeling, I had my Secret Service men actually watch his cabin.
On day 10, it seemed like the talks had just collapsed. Israelis would not budge on withdrawing settlements from the Sinai, and Sadat would not negotiate until they had been withdrawn.
And now Sadat was leaving. So I rushed to his cabin, and through a combination of threats, appealing to his reputation as a peacemaker, I persuaded him to stay. And then on Sunday, the 17th, the 13th day of the talks, I said, look, we either have an agreement or we don't. All day Saturday, in separate talks, kept the men apart. We were making progress. And by Sunday morning, it looked like we had an agreement. When I got word that Mr. Begin was leaving, as he totally disagreed with our reaffirmation that Arab East Jerusalem was occupied territory. Excuse me. So I gave him a new reworked version of the reaffirmation. And finally, after 23 drafts, we had a deal. And that night in Washington, the Camp David Accords were signed.
Prime Minister Begin said, the president took a great risk for himself and did it with courage. I think he worked harder than our Israeli forefathers did in Egypt building those pyramids. He said, today, I and President Sadat of Egypt shook hands and said, you are my friend. The Camp David Conference should be renamed, he said, the Jimmy Carter Conference.
Now, the Camp David Accords featured 2 separate agreements. The first dealt with the occupied territories and the rights of the Palestinian people. However, things would eventually be worked out. The second agreement called for Israeli troop withdrawal from the Sinai Peninsula and Egypt's recognition of the State of Israel with full diplomatic relations and use of the Suez Canal. It was all officially signed in March of 1979.
Well, the year ended on a high note, As in December, we proudly watched the Nobel Peace Prize being awarded to both Prime Minister Reagan and President Sadat. The president's approval ratings, which had started in the 70s, had fallen to a low 40s, were now back at 52. Not a bad first 2 years. I wondered what the next two would bring.
Disasters, figuratively and actually. In January, a revolution was successful in Iran, causing the Shah to leave the country and the Ayatollah Khomeini to return from exile. In March, the 3 Mile Island nuclear reactor up in Pennsylvania, well, the core melted down and steam with radioactive particles were released into the air, but that situation was very quickly resolved. And I actually felt that the papers made a crisis out of something that really wasn't one.
Well, since Jimmy had become president, inflation, which had been rising before 1977, was by June of '78 at 13%. And since the Iranian Revolution, that country's oil output had fallen, causing our gasoline prices to rise 40%. Thus, in June of 1979, a gallon of gas cost as high as 86 cents. Well, by June of 1979, Jimmy's approval ratings had fallen to a low of 28%. On July 15th, he gave a speech entitled A Crisis of Confidence.
Now, I want to talk to you right now about a fundamental threat to American democracy. The threat is kind of invisible in regular ways. It's a crisis of confidence. The erosion of our confidence in the future is threatening to destroy the social and the political fabric of America. In a nation that was once proud of hard work, strong families, close-knit communities, and our faith in God, too many of us now simply tend to worship self-indulgence and consumption. Human identity is no longer defined by what one does, but rather by what one owns. But then, I went on to answer the energy crisis. I laid out a detailed program to make our nation energy independent. It was a far-reaching program, encompassing coal, oil from shale, solar, and even foreign oil quotas.
However, the news media focused more on the crisis of confidence section, and the speech became known as the malaise speech. And Jimmy had never even used that word. 2 days later, he did something that shocked the nation.
I asked my entire cabinet to hand in resignation letters. I believe some of them had been disloyal. I accepted half of them. I needed to shake things up, including my way of doing things, but fate would not be so kind. In December, the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, and that led to my difficult decision to boycott the 1980 Summer Olympic Games in Russia.
Then in May of 1980, Mount St. Helens in Washington State erupted, killing 57 people, destroying trees in over 150 miles, and ash and debris killed many agricultural products, clogged up the Columbia River, which then halted shipping. But with the help of FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, which Jimmy had created by executive order in April of 1979, the cleanup and the restoration began at once. Then I had a major disappointment despite all of my efforts. The ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, was not ratified. And underneath all the aforementioned difficulties ran the most compelling and devastating event of all, the seizure of our U.S. Embassy in Iran by student militants.
And when the Shah left Iran at the start of 1979, he was like a nomad, traveling from country to country for asylum. His countries were simply afraid of offending Khomeini in Iran. By the end of '79, though, he was diagnosed with cancer, and word was he would die unless he could get treatment in the United States. My political instincts, fear of Iran cutting off oil, and fear for the Americans we still had in Iran, had kept the Shah from our borders all year. But now my humanitarian instincts told me we must allow him to come to the United States, which he did in October 22nd of 1979.
13 days later, on November 4th, a large group of students attacked and held Iranian embassy personnel hostage.
Then began the most frustrating and heartbreaking final 444 days of my presidency. Our embassy workers were blindfolded and paraded before cabinet. It was something unprecedented in diplomatic history. We stopped buying Iranian oil. We froze Iranian assets in the United States. We told the Iranians that if one hostage was killed, we would respond militarily, and began plans for a rescue if needed. On November 19th, they did release 13 hostages. In December, the Shah was well enough to leave the United States. His medical care was finished, and he found a refuge family in Panama. Then in January, with the aid of courageous Canadian embassy workers, 6 more hostages made a daring escape. And then came April 24th, 1980, probably the worst day of my life. Our attempt at rescuing the hostages failed. Now, our special forces had trained, and we thought we had a good plan. We needed 6 large helicopters to carry all the hostages to safety. So 8 copters took off that night from the USS Nimitz. They were to fly to a position in the desert we call Desert 1 to be refueled by waiting C-130 before they went on. But one copter had to turn back around immediately because of mechanical problems. Another got disoriented in a sandstorm and returned. That still left 6 copters. That was the minimum we still needed, so the mission was still on. They were refueled, and they were ready for the mission when another helicopter malfunctioned. Then to make matters worse, upon takeoff to leave, one of the other copters hit the C-130, creating a fireball and killing 8 of our men.
The President's approval ratings, which had reached a high of 58 in January, were now back down in the 30s, and another attempt at diplomatically freeing the hostages had failed. Well, the election in November, on the 1-year anniversary of the embassy siege, was a landslide victory for Ronald Reagan. 489 to 49 in the Electoral College. When someone commented to Jimmy, "Mr. President, you're a great example. You don't seem bitter at all," I replied, "I am bitter enough for the both of us." It was back to Plains, Georgia.
But not before I signed what might have been the most significant bill of my presidency, the Alaska Land Bill, which besides setting aside a large area for conservation, including the area known as ANWR, the Alaska National Wildlife Refuge, it also opened offshore drilling and 95% of the land for oil exploration. We also created a Superfund bill that taxed industries that did pollute, and they would provide money to actually begin to clean up the toxic waste areas we had. And all this was possible. I had a Congress where the Democrats had a 17-seat advantage in the Senate and an amazing 119-seat advantage in the House. I worked up till the final minutes of my presidency, even staying awake 48 hours straight to finalize the plan to free our citizens. And immediately after Ronald Reagan's inauguration, Iran stayed true to the deal that we'd finalized just days ago. The plane with our citizens was flying to the Army Hospital in Wiesbaden, Germany. And then President Reagan offered me Air Force One to go use, and I would be the one who would go and meet those returning men and women. It was a very emotional meeting.
Then, similar to our return to Plains, Georgia, after Jimmy's father's death, this trip was full of emotion. But really, my feelings were just the opposite that they had been then. Instead of dread, I knew that this would be a place of refuge and refueling for the future. However, we discovered that our business, which had been placed in a blind trust, was heavily in debt. And we might even lose our home. Then Archer Daniels Midland went into the peanut business. They bought our warehouse and we paid off all our debts.
But one nice thing about retirement was I think people admired me more. I have to tell you something. I believe my esteem in this country has gone up substantially. It's very nice now when I walk down the street and people wave at me, they use all of their fingers. But on a very tragic note, that October, we got the shocking news that Egyptian President Anwar Sadat had been assassinated. Assassinated for trying to be a peacemaker. I really felt as if my own brother had died. Along with Presidents Nixon and Ford, Rosa and I traveled to Cairo for the state funeral.
And Jim has spent the first year of his retirement writing his personal memoir, Keeping Faith. And I began my memoir, First Lady for Plains. Jim also began fundraising for our presidential library in Atlanta. I continued traveling the country and speaking out on mental health issues and the importance of childhood immunizations. Then one night I was fast asleep and Jimmy came and woke me, saying,
Rosie, listen, we can create a place near our library and invite leaders from all over the world to come with their problems, and I could act as a mediator. And thus, the Carter Center was born in 1982 and has grown into so much more. Do you know I've traveled to 125 countries to help resolve conflicts, monitored over 20 elections. And we, the Carter, I have 80 nations, operations in 80 nations. We helped try to spread peace and harmony and better health. As a matter of fact, we actually tried to set out to eliminate the 5 diseases that most affect poor countries. And we have succeeded in almost total eradication of guinea worm disease. Now listen, in 1986, there were 3.5 million cases worldwide. In 1922, there were 12 cases. Almost total eradication and without the use of medicine or even vaccinations.
On October 11th, 2002, Jimmy won the Nobel Peace Prize for his decades of untiring effort to find peaceful solutions to international conflicts, to advance democracy and human rights, and to promote economic and social development.
And just 3 years earlier, President Clinton awarded both of us the highest civilian award, the Presidential Medal of Freedom. At that time, he said, "No one has done more good things for more people than any other couple on the face of this earth."
Jimmy and I also started help building homes with Habitat for Humanity around Atlanta. That eventually evolved into us leading yearly week-long projects with a team of helpers to try and build 100 homes in a week, not only here in the United States, but in many foreign countries as well. It's known as Carter Work Projects.
I think we may have worked on over 4,000 homes. No, one thing Jesus did teach. He said, if you have any talents, you try to utilize them for the benefit of others. And speaking of Jesus, something else that's very dear to our hearts has been teaching Sunday school every week at the Maranatha Baptist Church in Plains. Rosa and I do have great faith.
Well, when you live into your late 90s, you need it to overcome all the health difficulties that have come your way. Jimmy Carter is a true survivor. His family was a rarity, as his father, brother, and 2 sisters all died of pancreatic cancer. Possibly the only family in America to do so. Jimmy has avoided that disease, but at the age of 90, he was diagnosed with a rare melanoma cancer of the liver. And then they discovered it in his brain.
And I really thought I had only weeks to live. But thanks to a new drug, I was cancer-free in about 4 months. But now we are nearing the end of our lives. I'm completely at ease, as I know Rosie is too, because as I said before, we do have great faith in God.
In February of 2023, Jimmy entered hospice care and celebrated his 99th birthday on October 1st of that year.
And in August of 2023, Rosie celebrated her 96th birthday, but she was already suffering from dementia. She followed me into hospice care, November 17th. Only 2 days later, God took her home. And although I was confined to a wheelchair, all covered up in a blanket, I attended Rosie's funeral. I wanted to say a final goodbye. As long as Rosalynn was in this world, I always knew I had someone who loved and who supported me. You know, Rosa and I communicate very easily, and oftentimes I think we have thoughts without even speaking. And I know we have been ridiculed at times for allowing our love to be so apparent to others. But I will state, it was not an affectation. It was simply as natural as breathing.